Hey everyone, how are we doing today? This is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and welcome back to another video. And in this video I want to talk all about isolating and attacking limpers and how we want to do it, who we're going to attack, how we're going to attack them, and effectively how we're going to make more money by attacking limpers. So this video is going to be pretty jam-packed. Like I said, we're going to talk about who we isolate, we're going to talk about how we want to isolate them, we're going to talk about things like sizes and basic hand ranges, and also talk a little bit about isolation in multi-way pots as well. So without further ado, we're just going to jump right into it, start having some fun, and talk about isolating limpers. So first of all, what is an isolation raise? Well, an ISO is when there's a limper, and essentially we raise and try to get him heads up to ourselves. Now, there are two different kind of players that we're really going to try to isolate, and those are weak type players and weak loose players. And you notice the big commonality between the two of them is that W for weak. Now, it should kind of go without saying that they're going to be weak players because they are usually players who are open limping, and usually open limping from early or middle position, which is something that a lot of good players just don't do, especially online. So because of that, we can very easily figure out that someone is probably weak just simply by the fact that they did open limp. So in a situation where we are isolating them, again, our major goal is really to try to get them heads up. And in doing that, we definitely want to make sure that we're checking our left as well. We want to check the people behind us who are left act. So in this situation, the button, the small blind, and the big blind. And we want to make sure that they are not going to call or light 3-bet us or do anything like that. We want to make sure that they're oftentimes going to fold so we can get MP1 heads up to ourselves. Now, if they were, say the button, the small blind, or the big blind, were going to contend with us either by 3-betting or flat calling a lot, maybe the small blind is an 82-14 fish, well, that's going to change our idea. It's not necessarily going to say that we won't isolate, but it won't be an isolation in the pure sense that we're going to be able to get MP1 heads up to ourselves. Because in an ideal world, I can do something like this where I isolate, get him heads up, and essentially get to play poker using my position, hopefully using some sort of card edge or an idea on how I can make money off this player, and I can really just go ahead, attack him, and expect to make a fair chunk of money. So we're going to talk in this video again about isolating weak type players, kind of who they are, what they tend to limp with, how we're going to attack them, blah blah blah. Going to do the same thing with weak loose players and then also multi-way pots. So let's actually start talking about weak type players first. So the first person we're going to talk about is the weak tight player. So in this situation, let's just say that under the gun is a weak tight individual. So first of all, how can we find weak tight players? Well, usually they're going to have tighter VPIPs and PFRs. They're going to be tighter players overall. And that should just be pretty simple by the fact that they have tight in their name. So that's pretty easy. So normally we're looking for that. But that weak, that big W part of their name is something that we're really focusing on. So how do we find weak players? Well, usually we can find weak players by the bigger gap in their VPIP PFR. Normally they're not going to have the normal 2 or 3 point gap like most good aggressive players do. They're going to have a gap that's a little more noticeable than that, a little bit larger. So we definitely want to make sure that we're looking for that, especially if we're using our HUD online. That usually makes finding these guys very easy. But also the fact that they're open limping. Again, something that a good aggressive player usually doesn't do, especially online. So it's very easy to find these kinds of players, and as games mature, usually there will be less and less weak tight individuals, but it doesn't mean that they're not still there occasionally, especially when you're playing the smaller games. So it's important that we know, again, how to find them, and then also how to attack them. So first of all, what do we think that they're going to be doing open limping with? Well, oftentimes weak type players are open limping things like baby pairs that they don't feel comfortable raising with and also don't feel comfortable folding. And then sometimes they also have some things like maybe a suited connector, maybe some Broadway combos that again they don't feel comfortable raising and they don't feel comfortable folding. So I'm oftentimes just going to assume that their range is looking something like that. And then the other thing that I want to ask when I'm thinking about what is a weak type player is how are they going to play post flop? Well, if we think about who they are, they're weak tight, and that weakness usually denotes passivity, and we're seeing passivity in the fact that they are open limping. So how do I think he's really going to play post flop? Well, I think most of those guys are usually going to play pretty fit or fold. They're going to continue when they hit or have some sort of strong hand post flop. And when they miss or they catch something like third or fourth pair, I expect they're usually going to be doing a lot of folding. So that's a good thing. If they are open limping a relatively wide, not wide range, but a range that's very easy to see, and we can easily see how often they're hitting or missing post flop if we just run some analysis, it's going to be very, very easy to play against a player like this because they're usually doing some limp calling pre-flop, probably going to be doing a fair chunk of check folding post-flop. So in a situation where I expect someone is going to limp and then call my raise a lot pre, but then play very fit or fold post flop, it creates a situation where I will ask you, why does my hand really matter? It's a situation where I think that he's going to limp call pre, check fold post a lot. All of a sudden my hand doesn't really matter all that much because I'm just getting this guy heads up, I'm abusing the fact that he plays too fit or fold post flop, and I'm playing poker from there. So that can be a very, very profitable thing for us. And that's something that we really want to look for is, again, abusing these weak tight individuals, thinking about how they play, thinking about where their mistake propensities lie, which again are usually going to be too much limp calling pre and too much check folding post. And it creates a very profitable opportunity for us to really get in there, get aggressive, and start abusing these players as much as possible. So let's go back just a second here to the point where we were thinking about isolating. So if I see a weak type player, usually my thought is going to be, I would like to isolate this individual, I would like to get him heads up to myself, and I would like to start making some profit off of him. That's just my general thought process. But there's more that I have to look at. I can't just look at, there's a weak type player, I'm going to isolate regardless. I have to look at other things. So in this situation, as we talked about a little bit earlier in this video, is that I need to look behind me. I need to check right, and if I look right, I see that there's a weak type player that I want to isolate, awesome. But then I also need to check my left, and I need to see who's between me and the person I'm trying to isolate. And in this situation, that's the cutoff, the button, the small blind, and the big blind. So in this situation, I want to make sure that I can actually get my isolation heads up, especially if I'm going to be using a quote-unquote any two cards mentality, where I'm going to be isolating very, very liberally against under the gun. So I need to be careful of that, especially when I want to start using things like, say, 9-8 off or Ace-8 suited, that kind of stuff. I want to be careful. So what I'm really looking for is, are the people behind me likely to fold a lot? If they are likely to fold a lot and they give me a great opportunity to get heads up with under the gun, again, what I was hoping for when I was going for my isolation, then I would be more likely just to go for it, assuming that they're tight. But if they're loose players, if they're fish, if they're going to be 3-betting me a lot, if they are really competent players that are going to call me and take position on me, call and make my life hell, then that's not really something that I'm looking forward to. So I want to make sure that I'm thinking about that before I go for the raise button. And I really want to make sure that I'm being careful. And again, if I expect pots to go multi-way, I want to be a lot stronger. I don't want to be using my weak hands. And there are certain hands that maybe I would have isolated if I expected the pot to get heads up, but if I expect it to go multi-way if I isolate here, then maybe I'll go for a limp here, or maybe I'll just go for a fold. So definitely make sure that you're not being too liberal in this situation. If you're confused, I'd always rather veer on the side of tightness. Again, stay out of trouble. And especially if there's aggressive players or fishy players behind me, I just really want to make sure that I stay very value injected as a default. So that's kind of what I would normally go for. And the last piece of the puzzle is size. And the size that you use here is really kind of whatever you want to do. Usually I go a little bit bigger because if I expect that under the gun is going to check call a lot limp call a lot pre-flop and then check fold a lot post-flop, all I'm doing is putting more money in the pot pre-flop that I can pick up with a simple c-bet on the flop. And that also means that when I do get heads up, that I can also go for slightly smaller c-bets because I expect that he's probably just going to be doing a fair chunk of check folding in the first place, which of course is really good for me. And I do want to be careful of textures. There are certain textures that I'm not going to be attacking, like 3 low card textures, or say like a 6-4-4 type texture where he's going to feel really comfortable with his small pairs. But pretty much every other texture like this, I'm just going to be attacking and trying to pick up. And again, why use a bigger size if I don't have to? If he'll fold for $6, the same that he'll fold for $8, I might as well just make the $6 bet when I have these small hands, which again is what I'm normally going to have, especially when I'm isolating with a pretty wide range against these weak type players. Okay, so let's mix it up a little bit and talk about the other side of the spectrum, which are the weak loose individuals. So let's take a situation like this where assume that early position is a weak loose player. So first of all, how can we identify them? How can we quickly spot a weak loose player? Well, usually they're going to look like fish if we're using a HUD, or they usually just are fish because, again, they're playing too many hands, which is that looseness. They're playing them passively, which is that weakness. So usually these players are very easy to find. Usually they do a tremendous amount of limping, open limping, over limping, etc. And usually they tend to have pretty big gaps in their VPIP PFR as well, but even bigger than, say, the weak tight player. So these guys are usually pretty easy to find and usually very, very fishy, and usually doing this with a range of hands that is just way, way, way too wide. And very, very difficult even just to figure out what it is, because fish are fish, they think weirdly, and they do weird things. So he could be open limping here with small pairs, could be suited connectors, it could be Jack 9 off, it could be Queen 5 suited. We really have no idea. And oftentimes we're playing with a big blind spot in the range. We're not going to be able to pinpoint it as precisely as we could, say, a weak tight player. And we need to remember that when we're isolating, both in the pre-flop sense and the post-flop sense when we're thinking about attacking them. So that's just kind of the general sense of weak, loose individuals. And the other piece of that puzzle is kind of how are they going to play post-flop? Well, they're fish, so most of the time they're probably going to check call as pre-flop. I don't expect much check folding from them. You can use stats like, say, limp fold percentage, but oftentimes you're not going to have a big enough sample to have a good idea on that. So use it if you can, but most of the time you're not going to be able to, unfortunately. So how are they usually going to play post? Well, they're probably going to, again, limp call a lot pre, and are fish very notorious for folding a lot of flops? Not really, at least not in the experience that I've ever had with fish. So because of that, I want to be careful post-flop. And because I need to be careful post-flop, I'm not just able to isolate pre-flop, c-bet the flop for half-ish or whatever size, and pick the pot up a lot like I could against the weak tight player. I'm going to be forced to play more post-flop against this fish, and I'm not just going to be able to c-bet bluff pick up a lot. I'm going to have to actually play poker, play turns and rivs, really be careful about my c-betting both in the bluff and value sense, and it's one of those where I'm forced to play a different style. So against the weak loose player, I'm not going to be isolating with any two cards or that idea anymore. Now all of a sudden I need to be a little bit more value injected because I am going to have to see a lot of flops of this guy, and chances are I'm going to have to see a lot of turns as well, a fair chunk. I'm not just going to be able to pick it up with the easy c-bet, which is really important that we're cognizant of that because that's going to drastically change the range of hands that we isolate with pre-flop. So in this situation, Ace-Jack is, of course, a totally acceptable hand to go for an isolation with. But again, there are a couple of things we want to look at. We still want to look at who's behind us. We want to look at the button, the small blind, and the big blind in this situation, and think about, are these players who are very likely to attack? Are they likely to 3-bet? Are they likely to flat call? If they're likely to flat call, is that good or bad based upon our hand? And thinking about, again, how we're going to make money, what situation are we logically expecting, and how we're going to show profit in that logical expectation. So in this situation with Ace-Jack, I'm pretty much as a default going to go for an ISO, unless I expect to get 3-bet just a massive amount of time and then I can't give it action for whatever reason. But most of the time I'm just going to attack. I expect that I can get EP heads up to myself a fair chunk of the time, and I have a good hand. So other hands that I would like to use here are like biggish pairs, like 9s plus. I like to use good Broadway combos, King-Queen, Ace-Jack, Ace-10, King-Jack suited, that sort of stuff. I can even use things like Queen-Jack and stuff. A lot of it will depend on how comfortable you are post-flop. If you're very comfortable, I'm more likely to isolate slightly wider, but again, value side wider. So things like Queen-Jack or Ace-9 suited. If I don't feel as comfortable post-flop, or I know that I'm a little spewy post-flop and I'm still working on that part of my game, then it'll probably be a little bit tighter. And again, there's nothing wrong with limping behind these players if you have a playable hand, but you don't have something that's strong enough to really go for a good isolation. There's nothing wrong with limping behind in certain spots. So make sure that you're remembering that, and don't go crazy here, and don't just start isolating everything, and don't just isolate nothing. So there's some really good monetary opportunity here if you're able to isolate well against these weak loose players. And again, there's a lot more weak loose players limping than there are weak tight players, especially as you move higher and higher, where weak tight players tend to get rinsed out, but weak loose players are still there. And then post-flop, it's just really, again, you want to stay pretty value side. So against these guys, usually I'm looking to actually hit something. I'm not looking to do a tremendous amount of bluffing because, well, fish don't fold on average, so where's my motivation to do that? And for the record, you can always use stats if you have them and they're appropriate. So for instance, if it was a situation where early position had a really high fold versus flop c-bet percentage, that could be a situation where I would go for a bluff c-bet. Obviously not in a situation where we caught top pair, but in a different spot where, say, we caught nothing, but he has a high fold versus c-bet, I might go for a bluff c-bet. As a default, again, you're not going to have a tremendous sample size on your opponent, especially the fish, and oftentimes it's kind of unreliable. So if you have good information, use it, but definitely don't never use information, especially if it's good and it's there, but definitely don't overuse information. If he has 100% fold versus flop c-bet, but it's only one sample, is that useful? No, it's not. So make sure you're thinking about that. And then post-flop's pretty simple. You're just going to play poker. And playing poker is pretty easy. We're going to talk a lot about how to play post-flop in this entire video series, so we're not going to really talk about this hand specifically, but it's important, again, that you're focused on what kind of range you're using pre-flop, what kind of idea you're isolating with, who you're isolating, and how you're going to make money against them, and then ultimately executing a plan based upon all of that, and also who's behind you, what you expect to happen pre-flop, and again, where's your money realistically coming from. So let's talk about another situation, one that comes up more often when you're playing live, but definitely happens when you're playing online sometimes, is the multi-way isolation. So let's talk about this spot, kind of things that we want to look at and how we're going to make money. So in this situation, I don't ever have an exact range that I isolate with in multi-way pots, because there's just way too many variables that go into it to have an exact range. So it depends on how many limpers there are, depends on who they are. Again, my skill edge pre and post flop tends on my position, tends on who's after me. There's just so many things that I have to consider in this situation. So in this situation, I have three different options. I can fold it, I can complete it, or I can raise it. That's it. And if you really sit there pre-flop and say, okay, I only have 2 or 3 options, and realistically think about what each of them is good for, how you're going to make money, what you expect to happen if you do go for that action, it can be really, really easy for you to figure out what to do. So in this particular situation, I first think about raising. Well, if I raise, what do I expect to happen? Is the big blind going to fold, or is he going to do a lot of folding, or calling, or 3-betting? Very, very simple. Then I start thinking about the 2 limpers. So the open limper, which is MP, and then the guy who limped behind on the button. The big guy that I focus on is middle position, because I think about it this way. If someone is bad enough to open limp, and again, online, if you're open limping, usually it's a bad player. So if he's bad enough to open limp, is he bad enough to open limp and then call a raise? Probably. Just simply because he's been passive, he's been cally, chances are he's going to continue that. Obviously, you can look at stats and look at things like limp fold percentage if it's applicable, but majority of the time you can just assume that if someone open limped, they're probably going to limp and then call a raise. So if I raise and MP decides to call, what's button going to do? Well, button's probably going to come along as well, because he's thinking, oh, the pot's getting a little larger, all of a sudden it's a little spicy, I can get involved with whatever hand I decide to limp behind with, my suited connectors, my janky broadways, my pairs, whatever. And all of a sudden what I've created is a 3-way pot where I'm out of position and the pot is slightly bloated and getting more and more bloated. So is that a situation that I'm really looking forward to? And not only am I looking forward to it, but do I really think it's going to be the most profitable? So if you don't feel comfortable post-flop, that situation is going to be tremendously difficult. Are you going to bluff c-bet? You're going to deal with overcards on the board a fair chunk of the time. That's going to be difficult. How are you going to react on low card boards? Not that they come a tremendous amount of the time, but how are you going to react? And raising pre-flop just to catch a set isn't really a good reason to go for an isolation here. So these are all the things I'm thinking about. And majority of the time, if I'm ever confused or I can't figure out if it would be more profitable to go for the isolation, I really have nothing wrong with just default play of call here and play poker. There's really nothing wrong with that. And again, I would isolate here if I had information and I knew it was a really good ISO. Either I knew how they were going to play post-flop, I know they're really spewy, I know how I can c-bet both as a bluff and for value. that's a different situation. But don't just raise because lols I have pocket eights. It needs to be more than that. And that includes when you have things like, say, ace jack, ace 10, Jack 10 suited type stuff. So make sure that you're really thinking, okay, what do I expect to happen? How many limpers are there? And realistically, where's my money going to be coming from if I go for a raise? And if I can't go for a raise profitably, then why not just limp it, especially with a pair like this, play poker, and go from there. And the same thing can be said for a situation like this, where there's a couple limps to us, and again, it's the same thing. If we raise, what do we expect to happen? Well, chances are we're probably going to get in a pretty multi-way pot pretty quickly. Chances are it's going to get a little bit bloated simply because there's multiple callers, which lessens that SPR. Also have to think about the people behind us, the button, the small blind, and the big blind. Are they likely to call or 3-bet or fold a lot? Is that good or bad? And realistically thinking about where our profit's going to be coming from. And oftentimes in this situation, the less limpers there are, the more likely I am to consider raising this. The more limpers there are, the more likely I am to consider just limping this behind or even possibly folding. Not this particular hand, but just in general. So, as a default, there's really nothing wrong with that. Again, if it's a situation where you can't isolate but you think you can limp behind profitably, there's nothing wrong with just doing that, trying to nail a flop, and then playing poker from there. So hopefully that's getting you thinking about multi-way isolations. Again, as a default, if you just play tighter in those spots, that's usually a pretty good idea. As far as sizing is concerned, when you're isolating multi-way pots, usually it's going to be a pinch larger, so something like the usual mantra is what, 3x plus 1x per limper usually gets you there. It's pretty close. So if there's 2 limpers, it's going to be a 5x ISO. So that's usually in the ballpark of where I want to be. If they're fish and I have a monster hand, I'll probably ISO larger. If I don't, or the situation's slightly different, I'll probably just default closer to 5x. So again, that's how I would think about multi-way pot isolations. Usually going to be tighter, especially out of position from the blinds. I want to be a lot tighter just because why create a situation where it's likely to be a multi-way pot with me out of position? That's usually not a situation I want to create, especially with weakish hands. So again, hopefully that gets you thinking on how to ISO multi-way pots. And again, just kind of as a default, staying out of trouble, being a lot tighter, more value injected, and not putting yourself into a bunch of bad spots that are most likely going to be negative VV. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. Again, we talked all about isolating limpers. We talked about who we ISO, so again, the weak type players and the weak loose players. Talked about the various ranges we want to use against them, the kind of sizes we want to use against them, basic post-flop ideas we want to use against them. Also talked a little bit about multi-way pots, how we want to consider different hands in our position and also what we expect. And then also remembering that in every single spot where we isolated, we always checked the people behind us, made sure that the situation was going to be plus EV, that we were either getting the person we were isolating heads up to ourselves, or if we were expecting multi-way action or expecting to face a 3-bet, that we were prepared for that in the hand type that we chose. So again, hopefully this gets you thinking about isolating limpers. Again, it's a situation that happens less and less as you move higher and higher, but knowing how to handle it can be very, very, very profitable for us, especially if we're playing in the micros or in small games. So again, same as always, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, best of luck out there, happy grinding, and good luck isolating.